All right, good morning, everybody. Just some last minute things to get set up. Okay. So this is intended specifically for AP. Let me pull up my script since I have a script. Okay, for AP, here's the current word that I have. So right now, AP testing is online. It's going to be all free response questions. We have not received anything. Now, that's not official. We just got that in a tweet from someone that works at AP Central. We assume that that's what it's going to be, but it's going to be all free response questions, no multiple choice. I don't know anything about if you don't have a computer or Wi-Fi at home, and right now the course is completely frozen at 75%, which is where we made it at. We would have been at 75% that next week. I don't really know what all that means as far as what's going to be on the test and what isn't. All I know is going to be all free response questions is going to be online. Again, yesterday when I talked a little bit about the extremes for those who weren't here, I'll kind of review it. But one of the things is that there's kind of two big extremes if you're going to be taking an online test. The first one was when I was getting my bachelor's degree, we did these online chemistry quizzes, and you would just log onto the website, type in all of your stuff, you know, your login information, get onto not Power School, Blackboard. Excuse me, I got the coronavirus. Take a quiz or take a test and then hit submit. There was no one there to watch you or anything like that. So that's kind of the one option where, you know, you could do it whatever. So we would go to the computer lab as a group, and then we would kind of talk through and work through some of the problems and things like that. There was a time limit on it though. So I guess the extreme would be no time limit. Then you have the other extreme, like when my wife was getting her master's, she took a couple online tests, and those were, she had to like lift her computer up and use the webcam to like show her area that she was in. So she had to have like no paper on her desk or anything like that. No books were out, and she had to like show them around the area that she was testing in. And so that's one extreme. I'm clipping my microphone. Let me turn it down. Okay. So that was one, that's like the other extreme. I don't know where AP testing is going to fall at in that range. It's completely up in the air as far as what they're going to be doing right now. And then, so that's the testing part. Grades part, grades are kind of frozen right now. You can still make up late work and turn in late work. That's less of an issue with AP, but you know, it still is an issue. And as with every other class, if you're not happy about your grade, stay in contact with your teacher and they'll update everything. And then for this channel, we're going to cover a lot of previous content. That's actually, I have a PowerPoint pulled up, so we're going to cover old stuff today. And then there will be a little bit of new stuff, because again, with environmental science, it's difficult to talk about old content and not have that kind of lead into newer stuff. It will seem like it's really fast paced. My plan is for it to be fast paced, because we're going to be reviewing old information. Excuse me. What other resources are out there? Same thing that I've been saying from the beginning. Khan Academy does not have any AP environmental science stuff, but it does have it does have stuff from for other AP classes. AP Science Panda on YouTube has a couple, let me scroll down. Has a couple environmental science videos for AP. Bozeman Science is all right. It kind of sits in the middle. Of course, AP Central, and then Crash Course has. There's just some random kid walking down the street with a backpack on, like he's going to go to school. Okay. And then Crash Course is a YouTube channel. They have some pretty good information, mostly geared more toward bio. But basically, make sure that you're checking Power School. We've been asked, and we've been talking as AP teachers, tell every single person you know to check Power School every few days. That's where I post all the information. After this, I'll move over to a Google Meet room, and you have to use your school Google account to get into that. It won't let you in unless you have a school Google Meet account. So use that, get in. I'll use that for like question and answers. I'll still answer questions as they pop up in the chat on here though. But make sure you're checking Power School. As far as everything else, like the schools being closed and stuff, closed until or through May 1st. That could change. Check Power School, check the Fort Wayne Community School website, all those different resources. Something might pop up in the news. I wrote this script yesterday, and it says currently not on lockdown. That has changed. You're supposed to limit how much you go outside. It's only for essential stuff. But that's pretty much where we stand with that. So let me load up my PowerPoint that I have and make sure this doesn't mess anything up. Okay, it messed something up. Okay, there it goes. Let me switch over to that screen. Nope, I don't want the camera. I want this one. Excuse me. All right. So we're going to start back at the beginning. Let me get a sip of water really quick, but we're going to start back at the beginning just because I wanted to review a lot of this stuff. One of the things that I've noticed is that people have been struggling with a lot of the kind of core concepts and things like that. That's outside of math, but they've been struggling a lot with core concepts. So I wanted to reemphasize that. Okay, my eye tracker isn't on. All right. So the outline of what I want to talk about today, and I'm going to try to keep these under like 40 minutes. That way they're really quick, easy, and we are going to be moving pretty quick. If you have any questions about it, ask with live chat. Leave a comment if you're watching this afterwards, and then same thing with. We can answer questions in Google Meet afterwards if that becomes, if you have other questions that you don't want to ask in chat. So we're going to cover basic definitions, organic compounds, and talk about cells. We're going to talk about energy, laws of thermodynamics, which is how energy operates, photosynthesis and respiration. We're gonna do a brief overview of ecosystems. This was something that we did go over in biology. It would have been one of the last lessons in biology, but we're gonna recover this. Talk about food chains, ecological pyramid. These are important. It shows how energy moves through ecosystems, and then how material is cycling. Matter cycling is going to be pretty important. I wanted to re-emphasize that because if you took ICP rather than chemistry, some people have really struggled with matter cycling. So some of the basics. Matter is basically anything that has mass and takes up space. So in front of me, my keyboard, my cell phone charger, my cell phone, the computer, all of this stuff takes up space. It has mass, so it's made out of matter. And what that matter is going to vary based off of that object. So you can have solids, like, again, my cell phone. You can have liquid, like the water that I just drank, or you can have a gas, like what we're currently breathing right now. With elements, these are substances that cannot be broken down into simpler forms. Most of the time when you refer to elements, you're referring to just the simple molecules themselves. If you look at a periodic table, that is the periodic table of elements. Got ahead of myself a little bit. So some of the basics, remember that atoms are the smallest particles that exhibit characteristics. Protons, neutrons, and electrons. So protons, neutrons form the nucleus, and the electrons are focused in a cloud that is around the outside of the nucleus. It's not close to it, but you could think of it like this model. Okay, my cursor is showing up. Like this model right here, where you have the protons and neutrons in the center, and then the electrons will orbit outside of it. This is a very simplistic model. If you've taken chemistry, you know that this, or AP chemistry, you know that this isn't 100% accurate, but it's close enough representation for what we're going to need it for. The atomic number will tell you the number of protons, but there are going to be differing number of neutrons, and that's going to give you your isotopes. So whenever I mention carbon for the most part is going to mean carbon-12, but we can use other things like carbon-13 in order to track how carbon moves through an organism. A really popular study that was done one time is they wrapped carbon dioxide comprised entirely of carbon-13 around the leaf of a tree, and that way when the tree took up that carbon dioxide and distributed it throughout the organism, they could come back later on and they can trace where that carbon-13 ended up at because it's slightly radioactive. And they found out that plants do exhibit some sort of altruistic behavior because they found that carbon-13 in nearby plants, saying that the roots are interconnected. They've also done this to track how far out the roots of plants go by flooding a plant with carbon-13 and then tracking where it goes to. Excuse me. So continuing on, a molecule is when you form two or more atoms together. So these are going to be most common, or they're also called compounds. So molecule sometimes can refer to like diatomic. So like oxygen, O2, would be a molecule, while some people consider like carbon dioxide, CO2, to be a compound because it's different types of atoms. And the chemical bond is going to change how that molecule interacts. So these are the forces that kind of hold everything together. Covalent is where you actually share electrons. This is going to be your strongest bond. You're going to see this in most things. Then you have ionics. This is what forms cations and anions. So you can see this really common in salt. So you have sodium and chloride that are bonded together. Chlorine will take the extra electrons from sodium, making sodium positively charged and chlorine negatively charged. And then you have hydrogen bonding. This tends to be really common in water. We see it a lot in biological systems. DNA uses hydrogen bonding to hold the two strands of DNA together. This makes it so that it is strong enough to hold them together, but it is weak enough that it can be kind of pulled apart when needed. This is why DNA can be destroyed through common heating measures, because what you're doing is you're actually separating a lot of those hydrogen bonds. This is the same reason why PCR, polymerase chain reaction, was very difficult, because as you heat up DNA in order to split apart the two strands, you were also causing the hydrogen bonding that folded the protein, DNA polymerase, to also break too, and it would denature that protein. Excuse me. So here's some common ones that we're going to talk about. Hydrogen. If I refer to hydrogen, it's going to be H2, oxygen O2, and nitrogen N2. Now, these are going to change states as they move through things. So hydrochloric acid, when it's in a gas state, is hydrogen chloride, HCl. When it's dissolved into water, it makes hydrochloric acid, which is where the hydrogen will give up its electron to chlorine, and basically you just have a spare proton that's floating around. So if you ever see proton, think about a hydrogen without an electron. Water, H2O, that one's pretty simple. It is in that bent configuration. Carbon dioxide, CO2. Sulfur dioxide tends to be a really common form that sulfur will bond into. Nitrogen dioxide, and then you have methane being the most simple hydrocarbon, which is made of 1 carbon and 4 hydrogens, and then they get more complex from there. So ions, bases, and acids are what we're really going to be concerned with in environmental science. So ions are basically where you have fewer electrons than protons. So if you ever hear about ionizing radiation, the reason it's called ionizing radiation compared to like electromagnetic radiation that your phone gives off is ionizing radiation has enough energy to tear electrons out of electron shells of atoms, hence making them positively charged because they have fewer negative charges. In an ideal situation, your number of protons and number of electrons are equal and it's electrically neutral. But we know that's not how it acts. We know that some molecules want more electrons and some want to give up electrons, making them positively or negatively charged. So acids are substances that like to release hydrogen ions. So think about hydrogen chloride back on the last slide. You have a hydrogen and a chlorine together. The hydrogen will give up its electron, become a stray proton, and then instantly you have this strong acid. While bases, on the other hand, are they want to bond with hydrogen ions. The most common one being hydroxide or OH minus. So you always label it as OH minus to signify that it actually has extra electrons on the oxygen. And if thinking about it, if you have a spare hydrogen and a spare hydroxide and you put them together, it gives you water, H2O. So this is where water falls in the center as 7 on the pH scale, being neutral. So pH scale is 0 to 14. Below 7 tends to be acidic. Above 7 tends to be very basic. So 0 through 7 tend to be, 6.9 essentially tends to be acidic, and 7.1 and above tends to be basic, and water tends to fall right in the center. Excuse me. So here are some examples. So you could see battery acid down here at the bottom. Stomach acid is very strong too, along with lemon juice. And then on the opposite end, you have lye, ammonia. So you see a lot of like soap-based products tend to sit more along like the basic level. And this is key because they are really good at absorbing hydrogen, so they can break down lipids and things like that. Milk tends to be slightly basic. or slightly acidic. Human blood tends to be slightly basic. Baking soda is up there too. This is why if you mix baking soda and vinegar, you get carbon dioxide as a spare gas that's off from it. I saw a thing on the internet somewhere, and it was talking about how natural foods tend to be more basic, but if you look at this, it tends to show quite the opposite. So looking at organic compounds are basically anything that is made up of carbon. All right. There are some carbon compounds that are non-organic. CO2 is an inorganic carbon molecule. But most of the time it is made up of carbon, either a chain of carbon. So like octane that you put in your car contains carbon, or they can be like benzene, where it forms a ring of carbons together. So there's 4 major categories. This goes back to freshman biology. So lipids being oils and fats, carbohydrates being sugars, proteins being proteins, and nucleic acids, and we only know of 2, DNA and RNA. So those are your 4 basic biological molecules. We did talk about this a little bit yesterday with the update on COVID-19, since most viruses tend to be made out of lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, more so proteins and nucleic acids. That is why washing your hands is very effective at treating viruses, because it breaks down lipids. So looking at cells, these are the basic building block of life. Anything below a cell is non-living. Anything larger than a cell is living. Or I guess I shouldn't say larger, but up the scale. So when you start to form multiple cells that do the same function together, you end up with tissues. So and then below a cell would be like cellular compounds, organic compounds, and things like that. So those would be considered non-living, but when they work together, it is considered to be living. They're surrounded by a lipid membrane. So you know the phospholipid bilayer, where it is a phosphate group with tails hanging off of it that are made of lipids. Those tails face inward toward each other, with the phosphates facing out. So you end up with the outer phosphate area being able to dissolve in water, so it is a polar molecule, while the interior is non-polar. This allows it to control what materials flow in and out. And once you get into the interior, it's divided up into organelles. Interior of a cell, that is divided up into organelles and subatomic particles. Enzymes, they're a type of protein. They usually form or work as catalysts to regulate chemical reactions. So an example is lactose. Lactose helps break down lactate, which is lactose is the sugar that is broken down by the enzyme. And so it bonds to the enzyme, it's broken apart, and hence it makes that reaction move a little bit faster. Without enzymes, it would take quite a bit longer for chemical reactions in the body to happen. Metabolism is the magnitude of enzymatic reactions performed by an organism. This is how fast you can break stuff down, if that's an easy way to think about it. Energy. So energy is your ability to do work. AP Environmental Sciences first period, energy level pretty low. 7th period for biology, energy level pretty high. Kinetic energy is anything moving. So if you were to push something on your desk, that is kinetic energy. Potential energy is stored energy. So if you have a battery bank or your cell phone is fully charged, which judging by every freshman bio student, they have no idea what charging a cell phone is. But that is stored energy. When we had talked in class about how an easy way to store energy from solar power would be to pump water up a hill. Once it's at the top of that hill, we can let it slide down the hill, powering generators along the way to recover that energy back out of it. In theory, that should be a perfect system. Energy that goes into it is what you get out of it. So that is another way of storing energy, is by putting it on an elevation. Chemical energy is when it's stored in food or fossil fuels. When we eat, it's a way of taking carbon and energy that has been locked away through photosynthesis and breaking that down and using it for ourselves in order to perform work ourselves. Power is the rate that you do work. the way that I always think about this is on a bike, there's a like a bicycle, there's a device on it that you can use to measure power, which is how much force you're putting out through the pedals. So if someone has a higher power than another, or if one cyclist has a higher power than another cyclist, they're doing more work, which means theoretically they should be able to move faster or move further. Heat is energy that is not associated with bulk motion. A lot of times we'll refer to heat as wasted energy. So when you start your car up, only a portion of the energy that goes into the engine is being used to move your car forward. The rest of it's being just wasted as heat and being discharged into the atmosphere. This can be useful, like in the instance of when you heat your house, you burn natural gas that is then converted into heat. Or if you have an electric heater, that is taking energy from, you know, the power plant and converting it over so that you get heat yourself. But for the most part, this heat's considered to be waste. Right now, my fans on my computer are on. Those are considered to be waste. And then temperature is a measure of the speed of motion of atoms in a molecule. When you measure the temperature outside, today's a pretty chilly day, you're thinking about that as those molecules are moving less fast than, for instance, inside of your house where you have heat. Those are moving a little bit quicker. So thermodynamics, basically these are the chemical and physical laws that kind of govern how energy works. So energy must be supplied from an external source to keep biological processes running. Think about this as you don't eat, you're not going to keep going. A common way or a common kind of thought experiment behind this is thinking about marathon runners. Marathon runners have a thing called hitting the wall, which tends to happen around mile 18 to 20 of a marathon. And once you start to get to that point, your body has depleted most of its energy stores and it's starving for energy. So it shuts everything down in order to keep the essentials going. Is it essential that you keep running? No. Is it essential that your brain keeps working? Yes. So your body starts to prioritize a lot of things like that in order to keep these biological processes running. Energy flows in a one-way path through a living system or into a temperature sink. Basically, we get energy and we use that to perform a function. Like if I pick up my phone or if I go on a walk. The other thing is just sitting here, I am using energy. As everyone in class knows, I like to talk with my hands. So moving my hands uses energy, but I'm also giving off a fair bit of heat. So human body is 98.6 degrees. That is energy that we are releasing. And again, it's an inefficiency that's built into the system. First law of thermodynamics, energy is neither created nor destroyed. It can only change. Think about us, right? We get our energy from the sun. I mean, we don't stand outside and recharge, but the light from the sun hits plants through a chemical process. They convert carbon dioxide into sugars, which then are consumed either by us or by the things that we eat. So with each successive energy transfer, less energy is available to perform work. We see this when we talk about food chains. As you start to move up in the food chains, it becomes more inefficient. And it has to do with entropy. Everything is trying to work its way back to this natural steady state. So think about when you dump water into a container and you shake the container. The water is going to move everywhere, but eventually it's going to settle back to a state of relaxation. So how do we use energy for us? Ultimately, most organisms depend on the sun to carry out life. I say most because we have discovered stuff that works off of hydrothermal vents in the ocean. Those things are pretty rad. You could look those up. So solar energy is essential for two main reasons. So warmth, obviously, like the sun must be broken today because it's quite cold outside, but for the most part, it's there to provide us with warmth. And the other thing is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a great process. Plants and some bacteria use it in order to convert that energy, the thermal energy from the sun and the photons, into chemical energy that then we can use. And that radiant energy transformed into high quality chemical energy in the bonds of organic molecules. High quality being a term relative to photosynthesis. So of all the solar radiation reaching Earth's surface, about 10% is ultraviolet, 45% is visible, and 45% is infrared. So this falls into your electromagnetic spectrum from chemistry. So most of it is absorbed by land and water, or some of it gets reflected back into space. We watched a video over what would happen if we terraform the Sahara Desert. If we terraform the Sahara Desert, it would change the overall reflectivity of the planet, therefore changing how much light and how much energy we actually reflect back. Only about 1 to 2% of the sunlight falling on the planet is actually captured for photosynthesis. Right now, because it's cold outside, and it's very cloudy, the amount of photosynthesis is quite low, but in June the amount of photosynthesis tends to be quite high, so that can be variable. Go to a more productive region like in around the tropics, you tend to have a higher level of productivity. Here's your EM spectrum. So here are your short waves. These are short waves, meaning that the from peak to peak tends to be a lot more compressed, and then long, so peak to peak tends to be much wider. So what we can see is in this narrow range right here. This is visible light, with violet being the highest frequency or the shortest wavelength, and red being the longest wavelength. This is the solar radiation from the sun. So the sun does not give off many gamma or cosmic rays. That would be pretty terrible for life on the planet. Now there are some stars that do give off radio waves. We can track them. They're called pulsars, and they rotate and they give off a specific beat on a specific frequency. If you know of anyone that's in amateur radio, sometimes you'll hear them refer to the bands as the wavelength. So for example, 40 meters. 40 meters is around 7 megahertz, but everyone calls it 40 meters because that is the length between peak to peak or trough to trough on a wave, while up here you're dealing with wavelengths that are in the nanometer range, so they're very, very tiny. And then these start to get a lot more bigger, or a lot bigger, as you start to move down in the electromagnetic spectrum. So photosynthesis, this is kind of the key process that we're going to be talking about quite a bit, but this occurs in membranous organelles of green plant cells called chloroplasts. Chloroplast being the part of a plant that actually makes it green, which means that, like I have a London plane tree out front, the trunk does not photosynthesize. That's just used for structure support and storage. So here's the equation. Make sure that you know this equation. So 6 water plus 6 carbon dioxide and some solar energy gives you C6H12O6 and 6 oxygen. So oxygen is a waste product from this. You can always tell a carbohydrate because it'll have a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio of your carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. So if I say something is C7H14O7 or C8H16O8, you know that that is a carbohydrate. This carbohydrate right here is glucose. So 6 water molecules plus 6 carbon dioxide molecules using solar energy gives you a sugar, and in this case glucose, and oxygen, 6 oxygen. Memorize this equation. Water and carbon dioxide in the presence of sunlight yields glucose and oxygen. And that's a sentence if you want to memorize it. I had a professor one time tell me that the easiest way to memorize the numbers in it is that it's the devil's equation. All right, so you have water, CO2, sunlight, glucose, and oxygen, but your numbers are 6, 6, and 6. So it's the easiest way to remember it. I know it's stupid, but you won't forget it now. You're welcome. Glucose serves as a primary fuel for all metabolic processes in plant cells. So respiration, this is exactly the opposite. This is, excuse me, taking the energy from glucose and breaking it down into a form we can use. Cellular respiration splits carbon and hydrogen atoms from the sugar molecule and recombines them with oxygen to create carbon dioxide and water. Go up to a cold window, breathe out onto it. You will see the water start to film up on it when it condenses onto the surface, but that is what we give off. And then we know that there's carbon dioxide in the air. So the equation runs exactly the opposite, but instead of putting in energy in the form of light or solar energy, you're removing energy from this. So splitting those bonds apart gives you energy. This is a photosynthesis loop. So it shows that this essentially should be a pseudo closed system. You are adding energy from the sun, but light comes in, hits a plant producer that gives off oxygen into the atmosphere as a waste product. Sugar or high quality energy is given off, and then when oxygen, once it gets to this point, so the top half in white is your producers, the bottom half that's multicolored and like this yellowish green is your consumers and decomposers. So this mouse rat organism right here will take in oxygen along with these sugars and it will respire. So what does it use that for? It can use it for biosynthesis, which is adding on body fat, adding on different chemical compounds within its body. It can use it for movement, it's just to like walk around. Membrane transport. Remember that not all proteins just allow free things to pass across. Sometimes there's active transport. And so that active transport requires energy. And this is where some of it's going to be used in this membrane transport. So you could think about it as movement, but instead of the whole organism moving, it's compounds moving within its body. And then bioluminescence, we've all seen the animals that can glow. That is used in this energy. And then, of course, heat is given off, which is low quality energy, and then it breathes out water and it breathes out carbon dioxide. So you can see that there's a lot that comes out of this. Now, this carbon dioxide and water then essentially ends back into the environment. Water and CO2 end up back into the system. Light combines it together and it kicks out your oxygen and produces a sugar. That is to say that when the sun does collapse in however many billions of years, that this process will essentially come to a halt. So species to ecosystems. This is using this kind of grand scale that we had talked about, going from cells that build tissues, that build organs, that build organ systems, that build organisms, so on and so forth. So above organism is a population. These are the same species in at the same area at the same time. Remember that when right now the letters were sent out for the census. When those letters show up, they ask you how many people live in your household, all of that stuff. They don't care about, you know, if you have a bird or a dog or a cat. They just care about people, and it's the same area at the same time. So in the house that I live in, there used to be people that lived here before us. Obviously my house is 100 years old. I am not 100 years old yet. So they're not going to ask like how many people used to live here in the past. They're going to be like how many people live here currently. A community is where you start to include a lot of those extra things. So if I'm surveying a forest, I look at, let's say, the tree community. So I'm looking at every species of tree rather than just, you know, what is the population of white oak trees that exist in this forest. I'm now looking at what is the entire diversity of trees or the diversity of plants in that community. You could also start to include other things in it, like animals and stuff like that. Then when you look at the ecosystem, this is when you start to include a lot of the physical elements, looking at soil types, looking at water types, things like that. There's a reason why at Eagle Marsh we consider that to be a wetland, because of the characteristics of the soil and the water presence and the plants that are there. Most ecosystems are defined by the plant community because those plants exist because of the ecosystem, those physical conditions. All right, there's a reason why you don't see cattails in the desert or a cactus growing in the middle of a marsh. And again, somewhat user defined means that we put a definition on that. We determine what defines a certain ecosystem, what makes a hardwood forest versus a boreal forest. And so we have come up with those definitions to it. And they're not bad. Those definitions are not bad. They're obviously still being tweaked and improved as we learn more about science and ecology. Then you also have open and closed boundaries. Open boundaries mean that you know where you're at. Open boundaries being that it's a little bit less defined, it's a little bit more fluid. So looking at food chains, so photosynthesis described as primary productivity. All right, this is taking energy from the sun, adding everything into it. The reason it's called productivity is because all other growth in an ecosystem is defined by what happens with these primary producers. The manufacture of biomass by organisms. Eating plants is called secondary productivity. So if, let's say, you woke up for breakfast and you had a salad, I don't know who eats a salad for breakfast, but whatever. Let's say you ate salad this morning, you would be, that is secondary productivity. All right. So a food chain is how you link all of those in terms. So let's say you woke up this morning, you had a carrot. So it goes from carrot to person. Or let's say that you ate, let's say that you had a hamburger for breakfast. Again, I'm not judging. Goes from like grass to cow to you. And so that would be a food chain, while a food web has multiple food sources. So again, if you had that salad, it's going to be coming from, you're going to have carrots in it and lettuce and all sorts of these other things that are mixed in that provide that source of food. You can do an entire course over all of this. It's called ecosystem ecology, which is how you track productivity and energy that moves in and out of ecosystems. There's equations that describe all of this stuff. It's really interesting. I know some people are like, it sounds really stupid, but it is really interesting. When I was at University of South Dakota working on my PhD, the professor there, Jeff Wessner, he was amazing at teaching this class. It was great. A lot of it is the theory kind of behind how all of this started. So this would be a food web, because you can see that you're going from like these microorganisms over to this snake that then eats, I guess that's a grasshopper that's eaten by a mouse, and then the mouse is eaten by an owl, and then nothing eats the owl. But the owl will eventually die and return a lot of its nutrients back into the decomposers. That would have been a food chain going from microorganisms to snake to grasshopper to mouse to owl. But if you were looking at it as microorganisms to snake to fox or mouse, and then those can go up to rabbits and then up to an owl, then you are looking more at, you're looking a lot more at or a food web. So a food web includes multiple sources, while a food chain is just following a linear path through this kind of area around here. And again, this does a really good example because it shows how terrestrial and aquatic are linked. We do kind of think about them separate, but they are a lot more linked than what we kind of think about when we lead on with it. So this kind of brings up trophic levels. Excuse me, let me get a drink of water really quick. So trophic levels are expressions of an organism's feeding status in an ecosystem. This is your role in the environment. If you want to know a lot about this, just watch The Lion King. At the very beginning, after Circle of Life ends, they talk about, they eat this and they eat this and this happens and all this stuff occurs with feeding. That is describing trophic levels. So producers are plants. There are some microorganisms that are plants. Consumers are everything that eats plants or other organisms. So you have primary, secondary, tertiary. It can keep going. most terrestrial food chains are relatively short. If you think about what we eat, it's only a step away from it's only a step or 2 steps away from plants. So this morning I had cereal which is made of grain, and so that grain comes from plants. Let's say I were to have eggs. Eggs come from chickens, which eat seeds or grain. So again, just one step of such separation. It's rare that you end up with a really high complex food chain, but they do exist. That's why it says most. Aquatic food chains tend to be longer because you're dealing with stuff on a small scale. So think about marine life. You're going from small individual plankton all the way up to whales, or all the way up to sharks. Stuff that just like, they're massive, they eat a lot of things, and they require a ton of energy. So looking at these trophic levels, sun comes in, photosynthetic plants, algae, bacteria. There are albino plants that don't photosynthesize, and they have to leach their carbon from other organisms. There are albino redwood trees that have white leaves, and so they have to get their energy from nearby plants through the roots. So then plants are consumed by primary consumers or herbivores, which are then consumed by carnivores, and then tertiary consumers, excuse me, so on and so forth, until you end up at top or apex predators. An example would be like a lion. A lion eats everything and nothing eats it. Sharks, apex predators. And then you have things that feed on all these trophic levels, like parasites, scavengers, and decomposers. So whenever one of these things passes away, you have scavengers and decomposers that kind of pick away at all of these different levels. So looking at the trophic levels, organisms can be identified by the type of food they consume. Herbivores consume plants, so an example of that would be a deer. Carnivores eat meat, that'd be a wolf. You have omnivores that eat a little bit of everything, plants and meat. So you can look at that as bears. Bears will take down another animal and eat that, or they'll consume plants. Then you have scavengers that feed on carcasses. They basically just wait for another organism to die, and then they pick off what they can. Crows are an example. Detritivores feed on debris that's on the ground. So ants are a really common source of that. So detritus is any debris that kind of falls onto the forest floor. You'll sometimes hear me refer to it as litter. It's not like litter like excuse me, like someone's walking in their park and throws a piece of trash out. It's, you know, leaves and things like that and bark and stuff that falls that ends up on the forest floor. And then decomposers, they eat everything, and they basically just work their way in and start consuming a bunch of stuff. And that'll lead into the last thing I want to cover, which is ecological pyramids. So looking at this, you have plants, which are your producers, work their way up to herbivores, carnivores, and then your top predator. So they have this labeled as a grassland in the summer. Due to the second law of thermodynamics, food chains are often inverted pyramids, meaning that you have most of your energy locked up at the bottom. Take a tree, for instance. A lot of that energy is locked up in the form of lignin or wood, and we can't get that out of there. I know there's people out there that eat wood, but for the most part, that's pretty stable. You also have metabolistic inefficiencies as you move up. So as this mouse eats a plant, it will be giving off heat. As this owl eats a mouse, it'll give off heat. And then, I don't know, this fox gets daring, climbs a tree and takes the owl out, and it's also going to give off heat. Predator efficiencies are always less than 100%. You never end up with 100% because we give off heat. Even plants give off heat. It's just such a tiny amount. So it's 10%. Every time you move up the food chain, you lose about 10% energy or biomass. That's why you tend to see more plants than you do apex predators. So if you take a 10 kilogram clover, that should end up in the next level as a 100 kilogram clover is a 10 kilogram rabbit, and then that'll end up as a 1 kilogram fox. And if anything ate the fox, then it would move down from there to 100 grams. But that's going to be where I kind of end it for the day. So I'm going to move over to Google Meet. In Google Meet, you guys can ask questions or anything like that. You can ask any questions that you have. And we could just have a discussion in general about everything. I will post that link onto PowerSchool. Remember, tell everyone that you can about checking PowerSchool. It is one of those things that you have to check PowerSchool almost every single day in order to make sure, or every few days to make sure that you're staying up to date with information. We will pass along information as we hear it, especially in regards to the AP exam. And the reason being is because we're kind of in the same boat that you guys are, where we are finding out things as we go. So if you need the link for Google Meets, I will post that on PowerSchool in a little bit. I'm in Google Meets right now, but I can't, it's not letting me set. Okay, here is the link. I will post the link in chat. In order to join the link, you will need to, in order to join this, you will need to have a Google account or your school account. It won't let you join otherwise. But I will post the link onto PowerSchool, and then we'll be over there. I'll be over there in just a minute. So thanks everyone for watching. If you have any questions, post them in the comments and I'll try to answer them, or send me an email. Keep an eye on PowerSchool. Stay safe, stay indoors. Don't do anything that could jeopardize your health. But I'll see everybody for AP next Tuesday, for biology on Monday.